Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Now, as far as the last class was concerned, I remember we talked about uh, specific effects of air pollutants, and then we had discussed about water pollution. Now, in this class, we will be moving a bit faster, and we'll begin with the other effects, like say noise pollution. Then you have soil pollution, thermal pollution, radioactive pollution, etc., etc. So, first, note down what are the things you will be studying as far as these pollutions and their impacts are to be concerned. So first come down to noise pollution. So write down what is what is noise. Write down what is noise, and then write down what is noise pollution. What is noise and what is noise pollution. Now, as far as noise is concerned, unwanted sound at the wrong place and at the wrong time is what we call as noise. Unwanted sound at the wrong time and at the unwanted sound at the wrong place and at the wrong time is noise. And the pollution or the disturbance or the inconveniences created due to the presence of noise in the ambient environment is what we call as noise pollution. So next, write down what are the sources of noise pollution. Write down what are the sources of noise pollution. Now, as far as the sources of noise pollution is concerned, you will divide the sources into three subtypes, three sources. One is the natural source, then comes your stationary source, and third comes your mobile source. The sources we will divide into three parts: natural source, stationary source, and mobile source. So as far as natural source is concerned, it includes say uh, events like say natural lightning strikes. So when lightning strikes, so it produces a lot of sound, so that is sound pollution and it's of natural origin. Then volcanic explosions, that also produces a massive sound. So these two are very common examples of natural sources of noise pollution. Now coming down to the stationary sources. Now stationary sources, as the name suggests, that such sources are immobile, they don't move. For example, industries don't move. So but they are massive, what you can say, centers from which noise is produced, massive centers from which noise is produced. And other than industries, you can have say our domestic machinery. We use television sets, washing machines, etc., etc., mixers and grinders that also produce noise, but these are from stationary sources. And then comes the mobile source. Now as far as the mobile source is concerned, it represents all those sources which can move. For example, our this mainly includes our transportation sector, our buses, cars, scooters, then the water transport, air transport. All these are massive sources of noise pollution. You must have seen that in the terrestrial transport sector, there is constant honking of horns, gunning of motors. So all these are sources of noise pollution. Then come down, write down what are the effects of noise pollution. What are the effects of noise pollution? Now, effects of noise pollution, you will break it up into two parts and study. One is the physical effect, and the other is the psychological effect. One is the physical effect, and the other is the psychological effect. Now, when we are talking of physical effects of noise pollution, it practically refers to damage to a particular organ of the body, and more often than not, it is the ear that is impacted. Now, remember, noise pollution, the intensity of noise is measured in decibels. So it is in decibels that we measure how much noise is being produced. So loud sounds can definitely cause what you can say hearing loss. That may be temporary or permanent. Or and which we often call as noise induced hearing loss. So hearing loss which has been caused due to noise. uh, this is a very common physical effect. Other physical effects you can think of, say hypertension, rise of blood pressure. Often people suffer from cardiac diseases, heart diseases, etc. Then comes the psychological effects. Now psychological effects, some of the commonest effects are loss of concentration, loss of focus in work. If you lose concentration in your work, that will lead to more frequency of errors. You won't be able to sleep properly. Noise commonly interferes with deep sleep patterns. And then difficulty in communication. In the presence of, in a noisy situation, we are not able to communicate. Even if we talk, we are not heard. So such difficulties in communications are faced. So these are some of the very common psychological effects associated with noise pollution. Then comes down to the control. Like air and water, you have to control noise pollution. So as far as the control strategies are concerned, first and foremost, you have to look for the location of industries outside the urban and residential areas. So because industries produce massive noise, so they must be placed in the situations, they must be placed in areas, environments which are located distantly from urban areas. Then if you think of the workers who work in noisy environments, think of the workers working in a blast furnace. Blast furnace is a huge source of sound, so they must use personal protective equipments like earplugs, ear muffs, etc. And then you can think of what you can say, development of industrial and urban green belts. So if we plant trees surrounding the industries, and if we plant trees in the urban areas, that will definitely help to absorb and control noise. And then comes definitely the impact of law. Now prior to 1987 in India, noise was not considered as a pollutant. So in 1987, the Air Act was amended to include noise under its purview. And the Air Act, which was passed in 1981, it was amended in 1987 to include noise under its purview. Okay, then comes what you can say, develop declaration of silent zones in the urban areas. So areas around educational institutions, schools, colleges, universities, around courts, around hospitals and nursing homes, they should be declared as silent zones where no kind of any horn should be allowed. And lastly comes development of awareness. So any kind of pollution problem, if you have to tackle it permanently, you have to build awareness, you have to carry on sensitization programs. So that was about your noise pollution. So in noise pollution, you will be definitely studying the definition of noise, what is noise pollution, sources, effects and control. Then come down to what we call as soil pollution. Now in soil pollution also you will do the same. In soil pollution also you will do the same. What is soil pollution? What are soil pollutants? What is soil pollution? What are soil pollutants? And then write down what are the sources of soil pollution? What are the sources of soil pollution? And what are the control strategies for soil pollution? What are the control strategies? Now, any substance which, when added to the soil, either advertently or inadvertently, which degrades the properties and the quality of soil and interferes with its fertility and productivity, is what we call as soil pollution. And those substances which cause soil pollution are called as soil pollutants. So soil pollution is practically the deterioration of soil quality due to your addition of unwanted and harmful substances. Now these sources of soil pollution, again, they can be natural or man-made. Now natural sources are plenty. Dead bodies of plants and animals falling on the soil in large quantities and decomposing, that is a source of natural pollution. Then if you think of volcanic explosions, so when volcanoes explode, they give out a lot of ash. That ash spreads out on the soil, thereby causing soil pollution and thereby decreasing the fertility of the soil. So these are two very common natural sources. Now if you think of the man-made sources, we use a lot of in the modern days of agriculture, we use a lot of agricultural fertilizers and pesticides. So these fertilizers and pesticides definitely, although they promote agriculture, but in the long run they ultimately harm the soil, they pollute the soil, they deteriorate the soil quality, they kill the important microbes in the soil. So that is how they lead to soil pollution. And then you have dumping of waste in the soil. So a lot of urban waste, industrial waste, it is directly dumped into the soil. So such waste dumping also contaminates the soil. And then one more practice which is very prevalent in India polluting the soil is open defecation. So several parts of India, we still don't have sanitary latrines, so people are forced to defecate in the open. And such open defecation also is one of the, what you can say, leading reasons for soil pollution. Now then let us come down to the effects. Now one of the principal effects of soil pollution is that it deteriorates soil quality and it deteriorates soil fertility. And remember, since India is still largely an agricultural country, our economy is still largely dependent on agriculture. So deterioration in soil quality will invariably cause a loss in our agricultural sector. So that is one of the major effects. Now one more effect which we can talk of, say, if you dump wastes in the soil, particularly solid waste, urban refuse, industrial refuse, etc. Now these refuse along with rainwater, it will diffuse, it will dissolve in rainwater, part of it, and it will leach and percolate through the soil and ultimately reach groundwater. And when it reaches groundwater, it will cause groundwater pollution. So these are two very commonest effects. Other than that, use of pesticides in the soil, use of harmful insecticides, that can cause multiple diseases in man, because ultimately whatever insecticides, pesticides we use, it is taken up by the plants, and from the plants it comes down to the human beings. So ultimately we suffer from variety of disease of the liver, kidney, stomach, intestines, etc., etc. And now coming down to the control, a major control strategy for soil pollution will definitely be to control our use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Now see, you cannot suddenly stop the use, it's not possible, but we can definitely reduce, we can definitely control the use, and gradually switch over to organic farming, gradually switch over to biological pesticides, gradually switch over to biofertilizers, etc. But this switchover cannot take place overnight. It requires a lot of planning and investments, and it cannot be done overnight, because we cannot completely replace the use of synthetic fertilizers and chemicals that will harm our agriculture, but we can, what you can say, supplement them. We can supplement these synthetic compounds with the natural products. Okay, and that is one of the control strategies. Then this dumping of wastes in the soil, that has to stop. So until and unless that stops, this indiscriminate dumping of waste, urban waste, industrial waste, agricultural waste, until and unless such waste dumping stops, soil pollution cannot be controlled. And then comes the use of sanitary latrine. So that is a facility which has to be made available to the people by the government, and obviously regarding its promotion, regarding its marketing, that also has to be done by the government, so that people use the latrines, because several villages and rural areas are there in which sanitary latrines are there, but people are reluctant to use it, people don't want to use it. So such reluctancy has to be taken care of mainly by the government and non-government agencies. So that ends your soil pollution. Note down the next type of pollution which we shall talk of, that is radioactive pollution. Radioactive pollution. So first write down what is radioactivity. What is radioactivity? Then write down what is natural background radiation. What is natural background radiation? Next, define radioactive pollution. Define radioactive pollution. Next, write down what are the sources of radioactive pollution. What are the sources of radioactive pollution? And then write down. Discuss the effects of radioactive pollution. Discuss the effects of radioactive pollution. Okay. Then write down control. What are the control strategies for radioactive pollution? What are the control strategies for radioactive pollution? Okay. Now, as far as radioactivity is concerned, now remember, whenever we say a particular substance is radioactive, that means from now every substance is made up of what you can say, atoms. If you keep on breaking down matter, you will arrive at atoms. Now there are certain elements like say uranium, polonium, which are heavier than lead. So from their nucleus of their atoms, they give out certain emissions. Now those emissions which come out from the nucleus of substances heavier than lead are called as radioactive substances, and the phenomena is called as radioactivity. The phenomena is called as radioactivity. Now, as far as radioactivity is concerned, remember, in nature, constantly we are exposed to radiations. For example, the solar radiations, the sun. Although the radiations which we receive on our planet are soft radiations, but still they are radiations. Then a lot of radiations enter our planet from the space, cosmic radiations, which we call them. So even in our bones, there are radioactive substances. So we are constantly exposed to radiations from nature. Even in rocks, sand, radioactive substances are present. So we are constantly exposed to radiations from nature, and these radiations which are present in nature, which are natural, and to which we are always exposed, is what we call as natural background radiation. So natural background radiations are the natural radiations which are always present in nature, from rocks, from soil, from the sun, from the space, etc., etc. But these are not the radiations about which we are much interested, but we are mainly interested in the man-made sources of radiation. For example, say, in these days we produce a lot of nuclear energy. We use it to produce nuclear power. Now, to generate nuclear power, you need radioactive substances like uranium. So mining of radioactive substances cause a lot of radioactive pollution of the environment. And then comes the use of radioactive substances in research. So a lot of research takes place with radioactive substances. So researching with these materials also leads to radioactive pollution. And then if you think of the use of radioactive substances in cancer treatment, medical use. So once uh, the substance is used up, the hospitals, nursing homes, clinics, etc., they are forced to dump these radioactive substances. So radioactive substances from cancer clinics, from medical units, they also cause radioactive pollution. And then if you think of nuclear weapons making and testing, so making and testing of nuclear weapons throughout the world also causes radioactive pollution. So these are some of the sources of radioactive pollution. So even in your houses, we are constantly exposed to radiation, say from our mobile phones, laptops, tablets, etc., etc., television sets. So these are all various sources of radiation to which we are continuously exposed. Now, what is the effect? Now, remember, the single largest effect of radiations which we can talk of is cancer. The single largest effect of radiations which we can talk of is definitely cancer. Other than that, it may cause aberrations in chromosome. That means it can change the structure of chromosome, or it can increase or decrease the chromosome number. Chromosome is present in our cells, present in the nucleus of the cell. So such chromosomal aberrations and associated mutations are very common associated with radioactive substances. So these are very common effects of radiations. Okay? So cancers throughout the body, skin, stomach, liver, brain, etc., very common. And then you have mutations, uh, mutations and aberrations of the chromosome. So you can make it up. Now, as far as control is concerned, now control of radioactive pollution will definitely lead to better management strategies as far as radioactive waste dumping is concerned. So as I said that if you think of the nuclear power plants, they are using uranium. Now the spent uranium, the uranium which has been used up, that is still radioactive. So the question is where to dump this radioactive waste. So there has to be a proper management strategy pertaining to dumping of radioactive wastes from research units, from nuclear power plants, from medical units where we are using radioactive substances for cancer treatment, radiotherapy, you must have heard it. So such management strategies must come up. Then if you think of say the nuclear power plants, often nuclear power plants are susceptible to accidents. You must be knowing them, that the Chernobyl disaster which took place in 1986 in Ukraine. Then you have the Fukushima Daiichi disaster which took place in Japan in 2011. Then what you can say, these nuclear power plants are always susceptible to accidents. So we need to take utmost care as far as prevention of accidents in nuclear power plants are concerned. Otherwise, if there is an accident, if there is a burst in the nuclear reactor, that will lead to massive loss of life and property in a densely populated country like India. So nuclear accidents, they have to be prevented. And then we must develop some control strategy to what you can say, prevent. There has to be some kind of a global cooperation to prevent the manufacture and testing of nuclear weapons. They are useless practically. So but still countries make them and threat each other with the purpose of using them, but they are practically useless. So there has to be some kind of an international strategy, global understanding to reduce the production and usage of these radioactive substances. So these are some of the control strategies which we can think of. So with that, we come to the end of the chapter on pollution. Acha. Now, the next chapter with which we shall begin today is what you can say global environmental issues and disasters. So, two topics I will be clubbing it together: global environmental issues and disasters. Okay, so I'll first write down what are the global environmental issues which you will study. First, write down global environmental issues which you will study. Write down number one: global warming and associated climate change. Write down global warming and associated climate change. This is a very what you can say hotly debated topic throughout the world, and what you will study here, you will definitely study the cause, effect, and control. What are the causes of global warming? What are the effects of global warming? And how we can control global warming? These three things you need to study. Okay. Now, apart from that, pertaining to global warming, you will also study the Kyoto Protocol. You will also study the Kyoto Protocol. Now, the Kyoto Protocol, you must remember that it's an international agreement which was signed in Kyoto, Japan in 1997. And the main purpose of the Kyoto Protocol was to combat global warming and to develop some kind of an agreement to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. Okay, to combat global warming and to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. So that was the overall objective of the what you can say Kyoto Protocol. Then come down to ozone depletion. The next global issue which you have to study, that is ozone depletion. Now, as far as ozone depletion is concerned, here also you will follow the same pattern: cause, effect, and control. What are the causes of ozone depletion, effects of ozone depletion, and control strategies related to ozone depletion? Cause, effect, and control. And apart from that, you will also study the Montreal Protocol. Montreal, Montreal. You will also study the Montreal Protocol. Now, the Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987, 16th September. It was signed in 1987, 16th September, and that is why 16th September is celebrated as World Ozone Day. Now, the objective of the Montreal Protocol was to combat ozone depletion, and another strategy was to develop some kind of a global agreement to reduce the emission of CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons. To reduce the emission of CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, because you know that these chlorofluorocarbons are the main villains for causing punching a hole in the ozone layer. Now, these chlorofluorocarbons, when they reach the stratosphere, they break up to release free chlorine, and it is that free chlorine which reacts with the ozone molecule, thereby continuing to destroy it. So, you have to study about the Montreal Protocol. Then, write down the next topic pertaining to global issues, that is acid rain. Acid rain is also a very well discussed topic. You must have studied it in your lower classes, and there also you will be studying the cause, effect, and control of acid rain. Cause, effect, and control of acid rain. Now, relating to this, pertaining to acid rain, definitely study about the marble cancer of Taj Mahal. Definitely study about the marble cancer of Taj Mahal in acid rain. Acha. Now, after studying these three global effects, come down to what we call as disasters. Come down to what we call as disasters. Okay. So, first write down what is a hazard. Note down the topics which you will study under disasters. Write down what is a hazard. HAZARD. Next, write down how is a hazard different from a disaster. How is a hazard different from a disaster? Okay. So let us understand the difference between a hazard and a disaster. Now remember, hazard is a potentially dangerous situation, but the danger hasn't occurred. It is a potentially dangerous situation, and hazards lead to disaster. Hazards lead to disaster. So if hazard is a potentially dangerous situation, disaster is an unfortunate event. A disaster is an unfortunate event which leads to massive loss of life, property, and damage to the environment and ecosystems. So, hazard is a potentially dangerous situation. For example, if you live by the riversides, so that is a hazardous location where you are living, and when floods occur leading to loss of life and property, that is a disaster. Say, for example, if you live in a on a mountain slope, so that's a hazardous location. So when there is an earthquake and landslides and mudslides occur, that will lead to loss of life and property, and that's a disaster. So a hazard is a potentially dangerous situation, but a disaster is an unfortunate event that leads to loss of life as well as property. And then please note down the types of disasters. The next topic which you have to study is the type of disaster. So write down. Now, as far as disaster types are concerned, we mainly recognize two basic types of disasters. One are the natural disasters, and the other is the man-made disaster. Natural disaster and man-made disaster. These are the two main types. Apart from that, you can also have technological disaster. Which can obviously be a man-made disaster. Now, as far as natural disasters are concerned, as the name suggests, you can understand that these disasters are caused in nature or caused by nature, and we have no means to control them. Say for example, an earthquake, a tsunami, a volcanic explosion. These are natural disasters. And man-made disasters, these are created by human activities. Say war, rioting. Ah, these are all your man-made disasters: a war, a riot, or say for example an industrial disaster like the Bhopal gas tragedy of 1984, or the Chernobyl disaster, that was a nuclear accident in 1986. So these are all the man-made disasters. Now there is one more disaster about which we have heard the term, that is a technological disaster. Now technological disaster refers to some kind of a failure or a glitch in a machine or a technology which leads to loss of life, loss of property, loss of money, damage to the economy, etc. So a very common example of the technological disaster which you can think of is the failure of the internet. Say if the internet or the world wide web crashes, what will happen? It will lead to massive loss in the banking sector, in the commercial and trading sector. It will lead to loss of information. Information will not be passed, the communication part will break down, there will be difficulty in medical facilities, etc., etc. So if that happens, if the internet fails, that is what we call as a technical disaster. Hmm. So that is also a form of disaster. Now please note down what are the major disasters you will study for your examination. Okay, so before ending that, as far as natural disasters are concerned, natural disasters can also be of various types. Say for example, geological disaster, earthquake and tsunami. Geological means originating from the earth. Then you have say a water related disaster. Say for example, a flood. Flood is a water related disaster. Even tsunami is a water related disaster, but definitely its origin is not water, its origin is the earthquake, below sea earthquake. Then you have say climatological disasters, climate related disasters. Say for example, drought drought, heat wave, cold waves. These are all climatological disasters. Okay, so these are some of the various types of natural disasters which you can think of. And now note down what are the types of disasters you will study. What disasters you will study for your exam? Write down number one, floods. Number one, floods. Number two, drought. Number two, drought. Number three, earthquakes. Earthquakes. Number four, cyclones. Cyclones. Number five, tsunamis. Tsunamis. Number six, landslides. Number six, landslides. So I'm repeating the names of the disasters: floods, droughts, earthquakes, cyclones, tsunami, and landslide. Now, for all these disasters, you will study about the cause, effect, and control. For all these disasters, you will study about the cause, effect, and control. And then the last topic, or the second last topic rather, for this chapter is you have to write a general essay on disaster management. You have to write a general essay on disaster management. Now, what is the meaning of the term disaster management? Now, disaster management leads to a set of activities or a set of steps which helps to prepare for a disaster, which helps to mitigate a disaster, and which helps to recover from a disaster. So that is what we call as disaster management. So disaster management refers to a set of well thought out scientific steps, well thought out judicious methods which will help a community or a group of people or a region or a country to what you can say prepare for a disaster, to mitigate a disaster, and ultimately to recover from a disaster. So disaster preparedness, you can break it up into three parts: pre-disaster, during disaster, post-disaster. Now pre-disaster, that means the steps which we can take prior to a disaster. Steps which we can take prior to a disaster. That is what leads us to disaster preparedness. That is what we call as disaster preparedness. Say for example, storing dry foods, keeping dry fruits with you, keeping some biscuits, storing some fuel, storing some medicines. So these are pre-disaster steps. Then repairing the broken parts of the house, particularly in earthquake prone areas. These are some pre-disaster steps. So that is what you call as disaster preparedness, because you know disaster is definitely bound to occur. So uh, that is what will help you to face the disaster. Then comes disaster mitigation. Now as far as disaster mitigation is concerned, now these steps you can take during or just after a disaster, particularly just after a disaster, because during the disaster, for example, if there is a tremendous shaking of the earth, nothing much can be done until and unless the shaking stops. For example, if there is a severe flood, so until and unless there is a slight recession of the flood water, nothing much can be done. So during the course of a disaster, nothing much can be done actually, but just after the disaster stops, the event stops, we can jump into action and say, for example, provision of medicines, helping out people who are in danger. Say after an earthquake, several people get buried under the building, so you have to take them out immediately. During the floods, people may get absolutely carried away by flood water, so that has to be stopped. So that will require some amount of what you can say preparation. So that is what we call as disaster mitigation, providing reliefs, medicine, blood, drinking water, food, etc. Then helping out people in need, disposal of the dead bodies, so that these things have to be done very rapidly. And then comes disaster recovery. Now remember, post disaster, after a disaster has occurred, several days might pass, and the what you can say the civic system breaks down completely. Often there is an outbreak of an epidemic, particularly waterborne diseases, and then the road transport collapses in the case of earthquakes and floods. The railway system of transport will collapse. Then the internet breaks down. You are not able to communicate with people. So these are some of the post disaster problems. Several people lose their lives, cattle lose their lives, loss of property takes place. So disaster recovery will practically refer to all those steps, particularly taken by the government agencies, to restore the pre-disaster condition. So prior to a disaster, the roads were okay, the railways were working fine, internet was working, what you can say transportation sector was working well. So recovery will definitely help to restore those pre-disaster conditions. Okay, so generally disaster management will, you can break it up into three parts: pre-disaster, uh, what you can say during disaster or just after a disaster, and post disaster. Okay, now lastly, pertaining to disaster, you will study about two major events that I can talk of. One is the Bhopal gas tragedy. It's a man-made disaster which took place in 1984. Bhopal gas tragedy, which took place in 1984, I think in the month of December, 3rd December, I think, 3rd December. So you have to study that, and then you will also study about the Chernobyl disaster. Then you will also study about the Chernobyl disaster. It was a nuclear accident, and Chernobyl disaster took place in Chernobyl, which is now located in Ukraine, former Russia. And these two are man-made disasters, be it the Bhopal gas tragedy or be it the Chernobyl disaster. These two are man-made disasters. Okay, so with that, we more or less come to the end of chapter 6. There is just one more chapter left, chapter 7, which we shall discuss, in the next class. So now ask me if you have any doubts pertaining to today's class. I'll be shortly uploading the recording of the class in my YouTube channel. So if you have any doubts, please ask me. Else I'll be ending the class and we'll meet again next Monday. Okay. Since you don't have much of a doubt, then I'm ending the class. Okay, fine.